Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Everyday Musician Podcast. This is episode 22.
Welcome to the Everyday Musician Podcast, hosted by Eric Mergala, a podcast where he has conversations with everyday musicians doing amazing things. Here's your host, Eric.
So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I have Kedrick Armstrong on the phone here for this week's episode of the Everyday Musician. Kedrick, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So Kedrick is an accomplished musician in the Chicagoland area, specifically in Wheaton, Illinois. Started music at the age of 5, is that right?
Yeah. I started piano when I was about 5 years old.
And he's also was an accomplished conductor and clarinet player when I first met him in Interlaken 8.5 years ago. Man, time flies so fast.
I know. It's like so crazy to think about. It's been that long.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But for the listeners who don't know who you are, what kind of projects are you involved in Chicago at the moment?
Yeah, so right now I kind of do a lot of different freelance things. So I've been serving as music director at a local Presbyterian church in Wheaton that has a kind of phenomenal music program, and I also run the concert series there. We have a classical concert series. For the past 3 years, I've been a part of the Project Inclusion conducting fellowship program with the Chicago Sinfionetta, which is a program that is working to kind of train diverse and minority musicians in the classical field, and they also work with conductors and administrators. And so this year I've been serving as the assistant conductor through that program for the orchestra. And then I've also been working with Lyric Opera of Chicago, serving as music supervisor for their Empower Youth program. And this is a program that works with high school students from the south side of Chicago. And the goal of this project is to really bring these students into the world of opera and to create unique stories and unique pieces of music and works that tell their life story. So it's been really incredible to kind of do all these different diverse things in the area.
What kind of themes has the opera project brought to life? Is there anything specific that has touched you in producing these operas in the south side of Chicago?
Yeah, so last year was kind of the inaugural year of doing this, and we took 31 students, they were all high schoolers, and we really sat down and listened to kind of what they wanted, the story that they wanted to tell. And one of the hugest things that they were interested in getting across is kind of breaking down this misconception of the south side of Chicago, kind of fighting the news story and kind of the one-sided light that is often shown on the south side. And so the opera was literally about a group of students banding together, fighting against this kind of crooked reporter and really telling the positive story. You know, it was really amazing to see these students who themselves kind of embody, you know, the pain and the suffering, but also this immense sense of joy and family and the community and dreams and aspirations, and to have them be able to tell that story to a practically sold-out audience, you know, at the Lyric Opera House was such a phenomenal opportunity.
So are some of these composers in high school? What is the age range for this opera program?
Yeah, so the age range, we work with students, let's say, who are about between 14 and 18. And the way the project worked is that they actually brought in a librettist and composer who basically journeyed alongside of the students. This was about a 6-month project. So they journeyed alongside the students, kind of taking in their musical style and their language, the way they talk, the way they dance, the way they interact with each other. And then the composer and librettist kind of went back to their musical huts and composed this piece, but it was a very collaborative process. So anytime there was a new song written or there was a new scene, we would present that to the young people. The young people would give us their feedback, and then we would tweak so that they really felt like they had ownership in the final product.
That's excellent. So was it, so what kind of response did these operas get? And how long did the operas go for? Was it like a one-night show, or did it go for like a week at the Chicago Lyric Opera House? How long were these operas presented?
Yeah, so it was a one night only thing. The show ran about, I believe, 50 minutes. So it was kind of a one shot deal. But what we realized, I think, there was such a positive response from the community in just kind of, seeing this group of students, telling their story. It's so easy to kind of watch the news and to kind of hear about, these kids on the south side of Chicago and all the things that are going wrong there. But to see, an entire stage full of life and energy and vitality and hope and community, I think really helped to start to shift the narrative of the South Side. And for the students, there was such a huge, response of most of them never saw themselves on stage. I think one of the important things that I have to mention is the majority of these students weren't necessarily performers, singers, actors, dancers. They were people who were interested in this art form. So we took a lot of them from having never been on a stage before to being on one of the biggest stages, in the U.S. And just to watch their faces go on this journey and to watch their stories be lived out on stage was really something spectacular.
Incredible. Is opera one of your favorite genres?
Yeah. So, one of the coolest things for me personally is that I love opera. I have a huge passion for opera. And kind of how I got involved with the project was through my fellowship with Chicago Sinfionetta. Being a minority, a diverse, a Black conductor is not something that is normal. And so Lyric was looking for a conductor of diverse background who could kind of go in between jazz and classical and gospel and hip hop, and so that's kind of how I got started with the project.
This is all news to me. This is all incredible stuff that you're doing, and of course I follow you on your social media. But no, it's really interesting to be able to talk to you because, the amount of work that musicians put in every day, people look at the surface, they look at the production, and they look at the opera, but all the hard work that you're putting in, the blood, sweat, and tears every single time, you're dedicated to these students to create such an impact in the Chicagoland area. And of course, that's what we do as artists. We need to continue to grow within ourselves, but also grow our communities, right? And that this is a clear example of, erasing the lines between communities and these amazing art forms. So it's just a pleasure to hear all this. Now, Kedrick, let's have the listeners learn more about you. What is your favorite color? Or these random questions that I've actually never asked any person on the podcast before. But I want people get to know you. You're a musician, but what are your hobbies outside of music?
Yeah. So to answer the favorite color, my favorite color is a combination between blue and green. They're kind of tied. For my favorite color. But no, outside of music, one of my biggest passions is cooking.
That's right. I remember you're a big avid cooker. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm actually standing in my house now and in the middle of kitchen renovation. So it's my second biggest passion is cooking. And it's really interesting because cooking informs my music life in such a unique way. But I keep the two things very separate on most parts, especially with conducting, right? As a chef, you kind of go into the kitchen, and I'm one of those people who opens up the fridge and whatever I have, I kind of, create. And, you're working with these different ingredients and all of this stuff. And the goal is to create one cohesive meal where everything is balanced. You have the right balance of all these things, the fat, the salt, the acid. And conducting is really the same thing, right? You show up in front of a group of musicians. Maybe you've never worked with them before. Maybe you have a deep relationship with them. And you have to go in and try to balance all of these personalities and these flavors and these colors and timbres and really try to create something, super unique and interesting and compelling that feeds, not only our physical selves, but also feeds our emotional self, our souls, and really gets at something really deep. So cooking for me is by far the biggest thing that I do outside of music.
Wonderful. So what are some of the challenges with conducting that you've found? Because actually you are the first conductor that I think so. Yeah, that's right. I think you're the first
really?
conductor. Yeah, you're the first conductor that we have on the podcast. So
Wow.
Yeah. So I've had a lot of instrumentalists, but not conductors per se. So yeah, this is excellent for the people who are interested in the life of a maestro and the life of a conductor.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges that you've experienced within the last few years, like when you're out in the professional world and the real world? What are some of the challenges that you face when you, like you said, in front of a brand new group of people and trying to balance these personalities?
Yeah, so I think, one of the biggest challenges that you kind of have to fight is yourself and kind of the whole conducting world. So conducting has always been this mysterious career that people embark on, right? No two conductors are the same. If you ask any musician or any person what makes a good conductor, everyone will give you a different answer, and people kind of tell you this is how you become successful, but there's no formula, right? There's no right way, there's no correct way to really building a career in this field. And so what you really have to rely on, and this is something I've been learning in the past few years, is who you are as a person, right? Who do you want to be as a conductor, and what things really motivate you and push you, and just the immense amount of work, right? I remember being a clarinet player, and you go in a practice room, you practice for 4 hours, and you walk out of the room, and now you know how to play a piece, right? And you're on your journey to knowing how to play a piece. As a conductor, you really can't practice unless you're standing in front of a group of people.
That's right.
You really
Yeah,
can't
I agree.
work on the craft and until you're standing there. And when you're, like me, and you're 24 and you're trying to make it, there's not many opportunities just handed to you. There's not many people who are throwing podiums your way. So you really have to work extremely hard to be an entrepreneur, to be, great at networking and great at building relationships, so that you can, get your friends together, get your peers together to really be able to hone this craft.
So that,
me,
another. You actually bring up an interesting point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you bring up an interesting point when you come out of the practice room, you have a clarinet, you have an instrument that you're practicing on for 4 hours, right? So,
right.
But yeah, and then it's very interesting because when I was doing my undergrad in Boston, I was part of a conductor's orchestra at the conservatory. So, the conducting students who are, master students at school, they would have like a weekly rehearsal time for 2 hours, so that way they could actually practice, conducting in front of these ensembles, right? And that's how do you go about that when you are practicing conducting and you don't, everybody has busy schedules in a situation where you don't have a lot of people that can volunteer their time to help you out. What kind of things do you do conducting wise, like in the practice room, to help you be prepared for a performance or for an opera show?
Right. So, one of the hugest things for me personally, and I think this varies conductor to conductor, I am a big, from the score kind of conductor, right? I was lucky enough to hone some of my, physical techniques when I was younger, and I had, some amazing conducting mentors, in my undergrad. So, yes, the physical things are the things that I'm still trying to work on, but usually I spend probably 80% of my time, before I get in front of the orchestra, just sitting in front of the score, right? And this kind of goes back to why I was a music history major in my undergrad, because I've always been the person who loves to ask more questions than I can physically answer.
Okay, great.
Right. So I for me, some of the most amazing moments is when you're like studying that score and, you know, you're up until 2:00 in the morning and you're looking at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony for like, you know, the 100th time. And every time you look at it, there's something new. There's a new question. Well, why is this way? Or why is the bar this way? Or how do I want this to sound? And how do I want, you know, the you know, exposition to differ or to be similar to the, you know, the recapitulation. So for me as a conductor, that's where the majority of my energy is spent, because then by the time I get in front of the ensemble, I can free myself of the score and really start to listen, right? And really start to dialogue with the musician. And for me, that's some of the most invaluable training is, you know, you're standing in front of an orchestra and you finally, after, you know, 40 hours of score studying, you're there. It's amazing to be able to actually communicate and to listen and to, you know, do the interplay of, oh, so the flute player is playing this thing differently than I imagine. What about it do I like? What about it do I not like? You know, it's really a collaborative effort.
I don't think I asked you this question yet. Do you still play your clarinet? Do you still practice? And are you involved with ensembles as a performer? Or not so much anymore?
I don't much at all. I find myself doing more piano playing these days, which is really like bizarre for me, because I all of my, you know, high school really private ensemble training was done in clarinet. But no, I hardly do much clarinet playing anymore.
Okay, interesting. So let's talk a little bit about your career in music history. What have you found to be like the most interesting piece of information that you've ever come across? This is kind of a loaded question. I'm sorry, but what I guess what was like a moment where you were in class or you were walking somewhere and you were like, I wonder what this person is about, and I wonder why this person made this decision to write this piece or why this piece exists. Like, what was like a moment that you can remember off the top of your head where that's happened?
So I think one of the hugest moments that still kind of racks my brain. Being a clarinet player, I didn't really have a lot of experience with, you know, Baroque music. So like Bach was always like that composer that you like knew was great, but if you never like had the opportunity to like really learn and play and study his music, there's kind of a disconnect. And I was sitting in a dress rehearsal for the St. Matthew Passion when I was in my undergrad, and I remember like, you know, this huge work, you know, 2 choirs, 2 orchestras, about 3 hours long, and I remember thinking to myself like this was his job, right? Like, you know, like this was, you know, you think about these composers, you know, of the, you know, late Romantic period who are writing music because they feel this deep sense of inspiration, so they start out writing a symphony. But for me, what started baffling me, you know, and I took an entire seminar on Bach's music in his life, is that like he was a church musician and his job was to write these cantatas every week, but he was also teaching and doing all this stuff. But even out of that came like this music that kind of transcends everything for me, right? You know, every note of the St. Matthew Passion, every note of the St. John, every note of every cantata are like these special, divine, inspired moments of music. And like for me, that started like a whole trail of a session with Bach and a study of Bach. And I think, you know, when you realize that, the way you approach the music, the way you rehearse the music, and I mean the way you communicate the music with the audience begins to shift and change.
Yeah, the St. Matthew Passion. I'm actually going to be performing it in April. So
really?
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm really looking forward to it. So the University of Massachusetts Amherst has not biannual. They have a Bach festival and symposium every other year. So they bring in people from all over the world, scholars who are experts in Bach that talk about the St. Matthew's Passion and what it's about and what the purpose of that amazing incredible piece of music. This is actually a really big Bach year for me. I've been performing a lot of Bach. I'm sure you know the Nu Kom der Heiden Highland cantata. I'm sure you know of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very famous. Yeah, I was able to perform it in December during my very busy holiday gig season. Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to be able to come across these amazing composers, as I'm sure you are. Yeah, so Kedrick, we are running out of time here. So I just want to ask one last question for you. And the question is, what can you say for the people who are listening in on today's podcast to encourage them to go to a concert or to encourage them to seek out information about classical music? And of course, you have a lot of compelling reasons to why you're doing what you're doing. But for the people who are unsure where to start or they don't know where to begin, maybe there isn't a lot of classical music in their area, what can they do to be more involved?
Yeah, so I think I would start this off by saying, just start with what you love, right? For me, I grew up as, the black kid in South Carolina. There was no classical music around me. The only orchestra that was like an hour away from me, I didn't hear an orchestra until I was well into high school. But for me, I remember like the classical music on like TV shows, right? I've been watching a lot of The Simpsons recently, and like it's funny now to as a classical musician to watch these shows, and you hear these pieces that kind of spark interest for you, and that was the beginning for me. But kind of a second layer to that, right, is to find arts organizations, to find music in your community that speaks to you, right? I think, this notion of pre-consumption that like, if I want to, go into classical music or listen to classical music or support classical, be the local orchestra or the local, opera house. And the amazing thing I know for me about Chicago is that there are so many kind of almost like indie classical music things going on in the city, and there's music happening in venues that, the normal classical, lover wouldn't go to. But, like I'm planning a whole series of concerts to do like in coffee shops and in bars, right? Really start to search out places that maybe like the places you love to hang out with and see if there's music happening there. And if there isn't, right, as it's not only us musicians that have to be entrepreneurs of bringing music into those spaces, right? If you have friends, if you know people, and you have a local bar that you love, right, see about the collaborations that could happen, right? I think we as musicians are always looking for opportunities to reach out and to go out into the community and to kind of, spread the love and the joy we have for this music, and we're looking for people to do that with and people to collaborate with.
I think that's very well said. Kedrick, thank you again for coming on today on the Everyday Musician podcast. And for people who are interested in learning more about your story, where can people find you online?
So they can find me on social media. Facebook, Instagram are kind of the places that I live right now. And I'll actually be launching a website in the next couple of weeks. So if you follow me on Instagram or Facebook, you can be watching out for that new website to come out.
And of course, I'm going to provide all that information for the listeners today in the podcast description. So please make sure to click on the Instagram, Facebook. Are you on Twitter also, or just Facebook and Instagram?
Facebook and Instagram are the main ones.
Yeah, just keep it simple. Okay, great. So again, everybody, thank you so much for listening in. Kedrick, thank you very much. And I really hope to talk to you soon and maybe form a collaboration in Chicago. I'm from Chicago, and I, spending a lot of time there trying to create some interesting projects. So, hopefully we can cook up something.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Everyday Musician Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcast platforms.
This week's episode was brought to you by Bandzoogle, an online website created by musicians for musicians. Sign up today for a free trial using the link in the podcast notes. The Everyday Musician Podcast was created by Eric Murgala. Music for the Everyday Musician Podcast was created by Ionix Music. Special thanks to Kedrick Armstrong for being this week's guest. I'm your host, Eric Murgala. Join us next week for another episode of The Everyday Musician.